There's a lot of ways that this can happen, but I will tell you, it's hard for people to wrap their minds around because it's so deceiving. And well, I hope that for the most part, people want to believe that other people are good hearted and are not going to be sneaky in this way. Unfortunately, there are now SOBs who, for a very large fee, will teach others how to take property by adverse possession. And many homeless advocates have learned this method and are now teaching it and encouraging homeless people to just find a vacant home and move on in, especially here in California, where it is very difficult to evict someone once they have taken possession of a property, vacant or not. Welcome to Your Landlord Resource Podcast. Many moons ago, when I started as a landlord, I was as green as it gets. I may have had my real estate license, but I lacked confidence and the hands-on experience needed when it came to dealing with tenants, leases, maintenance, and bookkeeping. After many failed attempts, fast forward to today, Kevin and I have doubled our doors and created an organized, professionally operated rental property business. Want to go from overwhelmed to confident? If you're an ambitious landlord or maybe one in the making, join us as we provide strategies and teach actionable steps to help you reach your goals and the lifestyle you desire, all while building a streamlined and profitable rental property business. This is Your Landlord Resource Podcast. Hey there, landlords. Thanks for listening to the Your Landlord Resource Podcast. I am your host, Stacy Casella, and I would like to welcome my co-host, Kevin Kilroy, back in the studio with us today. We missed you last week, Kev.
Yeah, I kind of missed being here too. But you did do a great job interviewing Dan on our last episode. Man, that guy is a real wealth of knowledge when it comes to being a self-managing landlord, huh?
Oh, for sure. I am so impressed with him. But if you guys missed that episode, I think it was episode 68, go back and give it a listen. Dan Borrero was on here talking about entrepreneurship and his experience owning rental properties since 1989. We'll link it in the show notes so you can check it out. All right, we have a lot of information to cover, which means we are going to split this episode into two parts. Part one, today, we are talking about what squatting is and the legal ramifications of it so that you can have a better understanding of how this can even happen. In part two, which will drop next week, we will discuss what to do if it happens to you and ways you can avoid it from happening at all. So squatting, or adverse possession, as it's called, is a bit of a hot topic for rental property owners these days. If you're not aware, there is a law called adverse possession where a trespasser can legally end up owning your land or vacant home or rental property if certain conditions are met. You know, the law has always fascinated me. I've always wanted to be a lawyer, but once I found out how much reading was required, I decided against it. But I remember back in the early 2000s when I first was taking courses for my real estate exam. And obviously, this was pre-internet courses and online learning. And at that time, you had the option to take a class in person or read a giant-ass book before taking your test. But the instructor was explaining the law of adverse possession to us and gave us an example of how someone could legally take someone's property away from them and not pay for it. And it really just stuck with me. You know, I've always learned best by listening to someone speak or tell stories over reading a book. They have stories to tell that really bring the content to life and make it much easier for me to understand.
Well, that's kind of the reason why we're working on a course on how to place your ideal tenant. I mean, there are a lot of books to read about being a landlord, and they have great tips in them. They really do. And even with our experience, we still will read new books because if we can pull even a couple of ideas out of it, they can save us time, money, or both, or increase our profit margins, it's worth the time and effort. However, there are a number of people who learn best by personalized instruction, and that is why it is taking us a little while to get that course done. We are recording each module with Stacy doing the audio, So it's just like being in a virtual classroom. There will be a lot of PDFs so you can follow along, and each lesson will be segmented into shorter lessons so that you can do a little each day and not feel like you have to sit for hours at a time. And for those of you who buy the course, we will be creating a private Facebook group with live Q&A sessions so that you can ask questions along the way. We really have thought a lot about how we can make learning all of the steps you need to take in order to find, interview, and place your best tenant. And once you learn it once, you'll be able to tweak it so it'll work best for your exact scenario. So anyway, if you want to sign up for the waiting list and have a chance to be in our beta group, we have a link in our show notes. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there.
Nope, you were right. Our course is going to be filled with our personal experiences to help our students learn. So it's important for people to understand what they can expect. But thank you for bringing home the point of why I remember the instructor talking about adverse possession. His story, which was basically about property lines, helped me to really understand the law, even if I don't agree with it. All right, let's talk about squatters now. And we're going to start with a little disclaimer. Because we are discussing laws, those laws are different for every state. We'll do our best to bring a more generalized understanding of what squatting or adverse possession entails. But if you need to know exactly how this can affect you and the property you own, contact your legal counsel or research what your state or county laws say. And this goes for all our podcasts. We are presenting you with information to pique your curiosity. So if you want to, you can look into a subject further and learn how it might affect your rental property business. So this is a very disturbing law, and many states have just started to take steps to reel it in to protect property owners. According to our research, there are about 100 legal cases of adverse possession per year. And personally, I think it's much higher than that these days.
Yeah, I agree with you there. So let me jump in here and talk about the history for a minute. I'm a history buff, and this is actually pretty fascinating. And also because this might put things in perspective for some of our listeners. So adverse possession goes back to English common law, where all land was essentially rented from the monarch. Lords and barons occupied the land at the pleasure of the crown and could not pass this land to their heirs without the crown's permission. In feudal England, land was defined by its usefulness to the crown. If the crown did not approve of the land's use, it could be seized and redistributed. Land was to be maintained and used productively, primarily for farming. So land was defined by its use rather than by its ownership. Land that was not maintained and used productively was seen as a waste. The law of adverse possession came from this mindset. And as land began to be owned by individuals rather than the crown, it was necessary to ensure that good farmland was not left uncultivated. If land was not being maintained or used and a farmer began putting it to good use, the law of adverse possession allowed the farmer to own the land after a certain period of time. This part of English common law followed settlers to the United States, and it still exists in U.S. law today. One common use of adverse possession in the United States is for redrawing property lines that have long been misrepresented. For example, imagine that two neighbors have a fence that misrepresents the original property lines, and one owner discovers this misrepresentation over the fence has existed for decades. This owner now wants to rip down the fence and take back their property and accuses their neighbor of essentially stealing land. However, the other owner files a claim for adverse possession, arguing that they aren't stealing. The other owner had decades to take back their property, but never did it. This adverse possession claim may well result in the court upholding the current fence's boundary lines, effectively redrawing the original boundary lines based on the decades-old fence. The owner that wants the fence ripped down has then lost some of their land to their neighbor.
You know, this is exactly what happened to us in Sacramento when that vacant land next to us was sold. So for 10 years, we owned the property with a vacant lot next to us on the south property line. And the folks that we bought our sixplex from put up a fence to divide the lot and the property our building was on. And unfortunately, they did so 1 foot into that vacant lot. And when the new owners of that lot surveyed for lot lines, we got a very stern and legal letter from their lawyer that they were taking their lot back. Our lawyer tried to fight it, but we lost. And now their property line, which essentially has a 12-inch setback for this building, sits right on the pathway to our units and our back patio. This is a 3-story side-by-side townhome, by the way. And I'll tell you that, we did luck out because the guys who live on our side are great and they look out for us, and it's been a good relationship with them.
Yeah, and they actually have a side door from the garage for egress onto our property too. Stupid cities want to build housing so bad, they just let anything happen. But in their defense, we didn't take the time to be part of the planning on it either. I guess we could have gone to the hearings and asked to see the plans before so we could raise any objections, and we didn't. But enough about property lines. The adverse possession that we want to focus on today is primarily about squatters who can gain access to your unit or property and claim possession. So this adverse possession must be done publicly, meaning they cannot hide their claim to the property. It is supposed to be long-standing and uninterrupted, and it must be exclusive. What I mean by that is they must treat it as their own land. They need to care for it and maintain it. They need to pay all the utilities, and in some states, they need to be paying the property taxes, etc. And sometimes you'll hear the term hostile being thrown around, and that doesn't mean hostile like they held a gun to someone's head to gain access. Hostile in this sense just means they took it over and the claim is adverse to the original owner's claim, which, my friends, is exactly why we have leases. This is to avoid this exact scenario from happening, which is funny because the best way to avoid having someone squat on your land is to give them permission to be there. Because if they have permission, this completely removes the hostile requirement in the law.
Yeah, which is why title reports, when you buy or sell a property, are so important. If you have sold a property anytime in the last couple of years, you might have had to sign a paper stating that you own the property and didn't obtain it via adverse possession, and that you have the right to sell it. Because there are so many fraudulent sales these days where people will find a vacant home, break into it, change the locks, and then call a realtor and sell it. And you guys, this has gone through and been successful a number of times. This fraud is less common with structures, but it's very common with vacant land. Because think about it. If someone owns land way out in the boondocks and they never go check on it, someone can easily go online and start paying the property taxes on it. And if you own a bunch of land, you might not notice that you didn't receive a property tax statement for just one parcel. Sometimes that land is owned by older folks and they might just assume that their kids have started to pay on it. Or the owner dies and the land is not in a formal trust and the heirs don't even realize it's part of the estate and a sneaky neighbor takes it over. There's a lot of ways that this can happen, but I will tell you, it's hard for people to wrap their minds around because it's so deceiving. And well, I hope that for the most part, people want to believe that other people are good-hearted and are not going to be sneaky in this way. Unfortunately, there are now SOBs who, for a very large fee, will teach others how to take property by adverse possession. And many homeless advocates have learned this method and are now teaching it and encouraging homeless people to just find a vacant home and move on in. Especially here in California, where it is very difficult to evict someone once they have taken possession of a property, vacant or not.
I can just see our listeners shaking their heads in disbelief.
Yep.
I mean, we do too. Slowly, many states are changing their laws to add a good faith component. And what this means is that if this adverse possession happens by accident or unbeknownst to the person taking possession, like what potentially could have happened in Sacramento with the fence lines, where you bought it with the fence already up and the other owners never said anything. Had you known or found out that that was not your land and staked a claim to it before it was sold, you would have been fine. You could have gone to the county and said, "This fence has been 12 inches onto my neighbor's property for over 10 years, and they have never said anything. We have watered the plants on it and picked all the weeds, and we want that land added to our property line."
I don't think I could ever do that, though.
Yeah, I don't think I could either. But if you're someone with an every man for himself attitude, the land size would not have been big enough for them to put more than one unit on there anyway. Then you wouldn't have to deal with their home sitting a foot from our property.
Yeah, well, shoulda, coulda, woulda, I guess. Whatever. They have an easement to go onto our property, and like I said, it's a good thing they're great guys. So, can you guys see how this can happen so easily? If you're in a state where you do not have fences in between the properties, and I know we said we weren't going to talk about lot lines, but if you are in a state where you do not have fences in between the properties and you have a neighbor who is creating a garden with a pathway that encroaches on your property, you can't just leave it there. At some point, they can say that they've taken care of the property and you never said they couldn't, and now they want it. There was something similar to this in Colorado many years ago, and the guy was awarded about 12% of his neighbor's land. It cost a ton in legal fees, and it took years for the case to settle. But that one person, who happened to be a judge, did a bunch of landscaping on a neighbor's lot with the intent of filing for adverse possession, so that his neighbor would not be able to ever build on it. Soon thereafter, though, the state changed the law that adverse possession must be done in good faith, meaning that it has to be an honest mistake. Like if in Sacramento we found out about the lot lines and the fencing way before, we could have, in good faith, taken it over. But I have to say, I still do not understand how a quote unquote honest mistake can lead to owning someone else's land. If you mess up, or a company you hire to install a fence messes up with the placement, it's a very unfortunate error. And personally, I'm not sure that I could ever fight someone on something like that.
Yeah, that's for sure. I completely agree. But I think the issue we really want to focus on is not lot lines as much as it is a person forcing entry into someone's home, vacant or not, and saying they are now going to live there. So, no matter whether you rent out a single family home or an apartment, and this rental is a long term rental or an Airbnb or a midterm rental, if someone gains access to that property when it is vacant and moves their stuff in, transfers the utilities to their name, and lives there openly and in plain sight, you have a very serious problem on your hands. But before you all start freaking out about this, it is our understanding that it can take years of someone doing this for them to be successful at claiming actual adverse possession and taking your property away from you. The real issue is the work you have to do to get them out and the potential damage they can cause to your property in the meantime. If you have a vacant unit that someone adversely possesses or squats in, you will likely have to file an eviction to get them out. So, what constitutes a squatter? They are someone who decides to inhabit a piece of land or a building where they have no legal right to occupy. They live there without paying rent and without legal documentation, aka a lease. And they state they own the property, are a law abiding tenant, or that they have permission to use or access the property. They would also have completely moved in all of their personal items and transferred utilities into their name. Seriously, you guys, if you think about it, this is really not that hard to do. Now, how does this differ from, say, trespassing? A trespasser breaks into the property through an illegal entry and does not have utilities in their name or any furniture or any form of a prior lease. So, according to this, the police should be able to remove a trespasser, right? And the answer is it depends on your state laws. The deciding factor is if the home is furnished or they provide any form of documentation, even if it's a fake lease, the police likely will not remove them from the property. They will claim it's a civil matter, of which at this point you would have to take them to court to prove they are not allowed there, and in some cases you would have to go through a formal eviction process.
Now, keep in mind that your current tenants can very easily become squatters. Even if the lease expires and you choose not to renew them, all they have to do is not move out. So I can't speak for other states, but in California, if you hold a lease for a year and the landlord does not formally assign a renewed lease, even if it's for a month-to-month agreement, the tenant's lease automatically switches over to a month-to-month lease. And if your property falls under the laws of rent control, and unless you are selling, moving into the property yourself, or doing a major remodel, you cannot remove the tenant from the property unless they have committed a major lease violation. But if they want to fight you on this, they have the right to stay until the court authorizes an eviction. This is what makes me so nervous about midterm and short-term rentals too. You better make sure your lease is ironclad because once someone is in your property, you chance them claiming adverse possession.
The bottom line here is that with or without a lease, squatters have rights to stay in a property until formally evicted, regardless of whether they are trying to actually adversely possess and take over ownership or just want a nice clean place to, well, squat for a few months while the eviction process takes place. They have rights. We can thank the homesteaders of the 1800s who did this when there was an abundance of land available to occupy, and our current government who is now scratching their heads and trying to figure out how to deal with this in the law.
So, wasn't there a case down in LA where there was an Airbnb and the person didn't leave and they ended up being there for 9 months living in this really nice
Yeah,
home? I think
I
it was a
believe
home.
that's recent. We just, yeah, read about that.
Yeah, I think it was 2023. So this is the stuff we're talking about. And listen, you guys, I don't have time today to discuss each state and their current laws on adverse possession or squatting. All states have a timeline of how long a squatter has to live in a property before they can claim adverse possession and file for ownership. What I can tell you is that there are only 3 states with adverse possession laws of 5 years, and those are, of course, California, Nevada, and Montana. All other states are 7 years or more. So I wouldn't worry so much about someone trying to take your property away from you and claiming ownership as I would someone trying to live in there and use the law of adverse possession to force you into a position of legally removing them. If you do want to read about what the law is in your state, we found a link to a legal website called NOLO that lists them all out. You can find that link in the show notes. You guys, we're going to cut it off here, or else we're going to be going on for over an hour. Next week, we will talk about all the ways you can avoid squatters from entering your property, as well as how to handle it should a squatter take over your unit. That is our show for today. We cannot express enough how much we appreciate that you've taken the time out of your day to listen to all we have to say. And we hope you've learned a little something about what a squatter is and some history behind how this whole law is even happening. Let me close out the show with a few housekeeping things. You guys want to text us a question? You can find a link at the top of our episode or in the show notes that are attached to each podcast. We would love if you would test it out and text us a question for our upcoming Q&A episode that we're doing pretty soon. And let me clarify one thing. When you text us, you're not signing up to be on a text subscription with us. This is the same thing as texting a friend. If you prefer to email us questions, you can do that too, and we'll link our emails in the show notes for you. All of our show notes include the links to everything we offer, so go and check them out. You can sign up to get on our wait list for our upcoming course and potentially be part of our first beta group. And of course, we have links on there to sign up for our free newsletter, plus all the forms and documents that we have created for you to download, like our email template for sending tenant renewals, the form you can send to an applicant's previous landlord during background checks, checklists to use for tenant move-ins and move-outs, as well as our spring maintenance checklist. What else? Oh, we have a 10-page guide on how to place your ideal tenant, which is a very good freebie. You should grab that if you haven't already. And most of our forms are free. We only charge for 2 items. So you'll also find the link to our private Facebook group and all the links to our social media sites for you to follow along. Thank you, you guys, for sharing your time with us today. We are very grateful that you find our content useful. Until next time, you've got this, landlords.